I watched a woman stand in front of 2,000 evangelicals and say the words that would get her excommunicated from half the churches in America, and I swear you could hear hearts breaking in that auditorium, not because she was wrong, but because she was right, and they knew it, they all knew it, but nobody had ever been brave enough or broken enough to say it out loud. She didn't look like a revolutionary, she looked tired, she looked like someone who'd been carrying a secret so heavy it had bent her spine, and when she opened her mouth, when those first words came out, I saw women in the audience grab their husbands' hands, some in solidarity, some in fear, because what she was about to expose wasn't just her story, it was their story. It was the story of thousands of women who'd been told to pray harder, submit more, bleed quieter. The silence in that room wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes right before everything you've ever believed gets flipped upside down, and I'm telling you, I've never seen anything like what happened next, never seen an entire religious movement crack open in real time, never watched tradition and trauma collide so violently that people had to choose sides right there in their seats. Her name was Marie, though that's not what people called her anymore, they called her the pastor's wife, always with those 3 words attached like they were her legal name, like she'd been born in that role and would die in it too. I met her on a Wednesday, the kind of regular unremarkable Wednesday where nothing important is supposed to happen, at a church potluck where everyone brought casseroles that looked identical and tasted like obligation. She was standing by the dessert table, serving pie to teenagers who barely looked at her, and I remember thinking she had that specific kind of smile people wear when they've forgotten what their real smile looks like, the one they practice in mirrors and pull out for public consumption. She asked me how I was enjoying the service, standard church small talk, but there was something in her eyes, something dark and deep like a well that goes down forever, and I made the mistake most people make. I asked if she was okay, actually okay, not church okay. Her hand froze halfway through cutting a slice of apple pie, and for just a second, for just one unguarded second, I saw the truth of her, and it was terrifying. Nobody tells you that the most dangerous place in some churches isn't out in the world with all its sin and temptation. Nobody tells you that sometimes the most dangerous place is right there in the pew next to someone who quotes scripture while their hands leave bruises. Marie had been married to Pastor David for 16 years, and for 14 of those years she'd been living in what she called her beautiful prison, beautiful because everyone could see the mansion they lived in, the luxury cars, the designer clothes at church functions, the family photos that looked like they'd been styled for a magazine, and prison because none of it was real, none of it was safe, none of it was hers. David was beloved, the kind of preacher who could make grown men cry during altar calls, who had a voice like honey and theology like steel, who'd grown their church from 200 to 2,000 in under a decade. Everyone wanted to be him, everyone wanted to be near him, and Marie stood beside him every Sunday in her carefully chosen dress and her carefully practiced smile, dying in increments so small nobody noticed. The first time he hit her was on their anniversary, which feels like some kind of sick cosmic joke when you really think about it, the day meant to celebrate love becoming the day love revealed its true face. They'd had an argument about something stupid, she couldn't even remember what, maybe how she'd folded his shirts or the tone she'd used when asking about finances, something small that became everything in his hands. He'd slapped her once, hard enough to split her lip, and then he'd cried, actually gotten on his knees and cried and prayed and begged God's forgiveness while blood dripped onto their bedroom carpet. He told her it was the devil, told her he'd never do it again, told her that marriage was hard and ministry was harder and he was under so much pressure, and she believed him because what else do you do when the man who speaks for God in front of thousands tells you he's sorry? She covered the split lip with concealer, told everyone she'd bumped into a cabinet door, and learned the first rule of her new reality: everything can be hidden if you're willing to lie well enough. But here's the thing about violence, it never stays the same size, it grows, it learns, it adapts like some kind of malignant organism that feeds on silence and shame. The slaps became shoves, the shoves became punches, the punches became worse things she still couldn't name even years later, and through it all David maintained his public face, his shepherd persona, his role as the man who counseled other couples through their marriage problems. I found out later that he'd sit in his office with struggling spouses and tell them about the sanctity of commitment, about how divorce was a sin that scarred children and destroyed testimonies, about how God hates divorce with a perfect divine hatred, and then he'd go home and make his wife wish she was dead. The hypocrisy wasn't even the worst part, the worst part was how good he was at it, how seamlessly he moved between his two lives, how he genuinely seemed to believe he was doing God's work even while breaking every commandment about love and kindness and basic human decency. The thing about living with someone who hurts you is that you start to lose your sense of reality, start to question your own memory and perception because the person terrorizing you at night is the same person everyone else sees as a saint during the day. Marie would wake up with bruises and hear David preach about love and gentleness and the fruit of the Spirit, and she'd feel like she was losing her mind, like maybe she was making it all up, like maybe she was the problem he kept telling her she was. He had this way of making everything her fault. Every explosion of rage was actually her doing, her tone, her attitude, her failure to be the helpmeet God had called her to be. He'd quote scripture at her while his hands were still shaking from whatever he'd just done, tell her that a gentle and quiet spirit was precious in God's sight, that her resistance to his leadership was rebellion against God himself, that if she'd just learned to submit properly none of this would be necessary. Marie tried everything the church told her to try, and this is where the story gets complicated. This is where it stops being about one bad man and starts being about an entire system that protects bad men. She went to the elders first, the church leadership, 3 men who'd known David since seminary, who'd helped plant the church, who loved him like a son. She showed them the bruises on her arms, told them about the fear that lived in her chest like a permanent resident, asked for help in the voice of someone who's already given up hope of receiving it. They listened, they nodded, they prayed over her, and then they told her to go home and be a better wife. They said David was under spiritual attack, that Satan was trying to destroy their ministry through her rebellion, that submission wasn't just suggested, it was commanded, that her role was to support her husband, not undermine him, especially not to outsiders, especially not about something as private and sacred as their marriage. One of them actually quoted that verse about wives submitting to husbands as if getting beaten was somehow part of God's plan for her sanctification. She went to other pastors, leaders from neighboring churches, men she thought might see clearly because they weren't as close to David, weren't as invested in protecting his reputation. Same story, different office, different sympathy faces, same conclusion. They talked about forgiveness, about how marriage was a covenant not a contract, about how God could heal any relationship if both people were willing to do the work, as if the work of not beating your wife was somehow negotiable. One pastor told her that leaving would be giving Satan a foothold, that divorce was worse than death because at least death was natural but divorce was rebellion against God's design. Another asked what she'd done to provoke David, asked about her tone, her submission level, whether she'd been fulfilling her marital duties, turning her trauma into an investigation of her own adequacy. The message was clear and consistent: suffer in silence, pray harder, and whatever you do, don't break the illusion, don't make us confront the fact that one of our own is a monster in shepherd's clothing. What Marie didn't know then but learned later was that this wasn't accidental, wasn't just individual pastors making bad calls in isolation. This was the logical outcome of a theology that prioritizes male authority over everything else, that sees questioning leadership as more dangerous than abuse by leadership. The entire system was designed to protect itself, to maintain its structure even at the cost of individual lives, and she was just one of thousands of women being ground up in that machinery. There were women in her own church, women she sat next to every Sunday who were living the same nightmare, wearing the same practiced smiles, covering the same bruises, and none of them knew about each other because the system depended on isolation, on each woman thinking she was alone, that her situation was unique, that if she just tried harder or prayed better or submitted more completely everything would be fine. So she stayed, and staying nearly killed her, not dramatically, not in one explosive moment, but in the slow erosion of everything that made her human. She learned to read his moods like weather patterns, learned which facial expressions meant safety and which meant danger, learned to make herself small and quiet and nearly invisible. She stopped having opinions, stopped expressing needs, stopped existing as anything other than an extension of his public image. Their kids, 2 daughters who I'd later meet and who still carry the weight of what they witnessed, learned to tiptoe through their own home, learned that daddy's anger was everyone's emergency, learned that mommy's job was to absorb his rage so they didn't have to. This was their normal, this was what church leadership had effectively endorsed. This was the fruit of a theology that valued institutional stability over individual safety. The girls, Emma and Sarah, they developed their own survival mechanisms, their own ways of navigating the minefield of their father's moods and their mother's silent suffering. Emma, the older one, became hypervigilant, always watching, always trying to predict and prevent the next explosion, carrying a burden no child should carry. Sarah became invisible, perfected the art of disappearing into her room, into her books, into fantasies where families were safe and fathers were kind. They never had friends over, never invited anyone into their home because you never knew which version of dad would show up, the charming pastor everyone loved or the tyrant who ruled their house with an iron fist wrapped in scripture. They learned to lie for him, learned to make excuses when someone noticed something off, learned that protecting the family image was more important than protecting themselves. Marie watched her daughters learn these lessons and it broke something in her that she hadn't even known could break, watching innocence curdle into hypervigilance, watching childhood get sacrificed on the altar of keeping daddy's secret. She thought she was protecting them by staying, thought that an intact family was better than a broken one, but she was starting to understand that her family was already broken, had been broken for years, and staying was just teaching her daughters that this was what love looked like, that this was what they should accept in their own future relationships. The cycle was perpetuating itself right in front of her eyes, and she felt powerless to stop it because leaving would mean admitting failure, would mean facing the church's judgment, would mean losing everything they'd built together even if what they'd built was made of lies and held together with fear. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night after a board meeting where the church had voted to expand again, to build a bigger sanctuary, to reach more souls for Christ. David came home riding high on his own importance, drunk on the power of being seen as anointed, and he found Marie in bed already because she'd been exhausted, legitimately physically exhausted from a day of volunteer work at the church. He woke her up angry, told her she was lazy, told her she was embarrassing him by not being present enough at church functions, told her things I won't repeat because they're too cruel and too specific. When she tried to explain, tried to defend herself, he grabbed her by the throat and slammed her against the headboard hard enough that she saw stars, hard enough that she heard something crack, and in that moment suspended between consciousness and unconsciousness, she had a thought that changed everything. She thought, if I die tonight, they'll call it a tragedy, they'll give me a beautiful funeral, they'll say I'm with Jesus now, and nobody will ever know the truth. That thought terrified her more than dying did, the idea that her life could be erased so completely, that her suffering could be repackaged as some kind of spiritual victory, that the system would close ranks and protect itself even over her dead body. She imagined David standing at her funeral, tears streaming down his face, preaching about how precious she'd been, how she was dancing with Jesus now, how God's ways are mysterious but always good, and everyone would believe him, everyone would comfort him, and the truth would die with her. That vision, that nightmare of her own erasure, it jolted something awake in her that had been sleeping for years, some instinct for survival that hadn't been completely beaten out of her yet. So she made a decision that night with her neck still throbbing and her vision still swimming. She decided that if she was going to die in this marriage, she was at least going to die telling the truth. The next morning she called a domestic violence hotline, the first time she'd ever used those words to describe her life. Domestic violence, speaking them out loud made them real in a way they'd never been before. The counselor on the phone didn't ask what she'd done to provoke it, didn't suggest prayer or submission, didn't tell her to go back and try harder. Instead she said 6 words that Marie told me later she still hears in her quietest moments: you deserve to be safe and loved. Those words landed in a place inside her that had been parched and cracked and dying, watered something that had nearly withered away completely, gave her permission to want something she'd been taught wanting was sinful, the permission to prioritize her own survival. Getting out was harder than anything she'd ever done, harder than staying had been even, because staying was passive but leaving required action, required planning, required believing she deserved better when everyone around her had spent years convincing her she didn't. She documented everything, took photos of bruises with her phone camera, hiding the evidence in cloud storage David didn't know about, recorded screaming matches when she could do it safely, saved threatening text messages and emails, built a case like she was preparing for war because in many ways she was. She researched lawyers quietly, using incognito browsers at the library when she volunteered there, learning about protective orders and custody arrangements and how to hide assets so she'd have something to start over with. She filed for divorce quietly, worked with a lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases, arranged for her and the girls to move to a safe house whose location David couldn't access. The day she served him papers was the day she stopped being the pastor's wife and became something the church didn't have a category for, a woman who'd chosen herself over the institution, a truth teller in a place that preferred beautiful lies. David's reaction was exactly what she'd expected and still somehow more terrifying than she'd prepared for. He shifted instantly from the version of himself that pretended remorse to the version that was pure rage, threatened her with everything he could think of, told her she'd never see her daughters again, that he'd destroy her reputation, that he'd make sure everyone knew what a failure she was as a wife and mother and Christian. He used his position, his influence, tried to turn the church against her before she could tell her side, painted himself as the victim of a wayward wife who'd abandoned her family and her faith. He cried real tears in front of the congregation, performed grief and betrayal so convincingly that people who'd known Marie for years looked at her like she was a stranger, like she'd become someone they didn't recognize. The church's response was exactly what she'd expected and somehow still more painful than she'd imagined. They excommunicated her, officially and publicly, in a Sunday service she wasn't present for but heard about from friends who still loved her despite the risk. David stood in the pulpit with tears streaming down his face and told the congregation that his wife had abandoned him, that she'd fallen away from faith, that he'd tried everything to save their marriage but she'd hardened her heart against God and against him. He didn't mention the violence, didn't mention the years of terror, didn't mention anything that would complicate his victim narrative. The congregation, the same people who'd known Marie for 16 years, who'd eaten her cooking and celebrated their kids' birthdays and prayed with her at women's Bible studies, they believed him, most of them, or at least they pretended to. They sent her messages calling her Jezebel, calling her a home wrecker, telling her she was destroying a man of God and damaging the gospel witness. But there were a handful of women who reached out privately, carefully, women who said things like I believe you, or I've seen things, or I'm praying for you, and I mean the kind of prayers that ask for your safety, not your repentance. These women became Marie's lifeline in those early days, proof that she wasn't crazy, that what she'd experienced was real, that leaving had been the right choice even when it felt like the hardest thing she'd ever done. They met in coffee shops far from the church, in each other's homes when husbands were at work, in parking lots and parks, and anywhere they could talk without being seen by people who'd report back to David or the elders. And slowly, carefully, these women started sharing their own stories, started admitting that Marie's experience wasn't unique, that there were patterns, that the problem went deeper than one bad marriage. But here's where the story shifts, here's where one woman's pain becomes a movement, because Marie didn't disappear quietly like they'd expected. She started talking, not loudly at first, just in small groups, in private conversations with other women who'd approached her with their own stories, women who'd been waiting for someone to go first, to prove it was possible to leave and survive. She discovered she wasn't alone, discovered there were hundreds of women in their denomination alone who'd experienced some version of what she'd survived, who'd been told by church leaders to endure abuse in the name of Christian witness. These women started meeting, started organizing, started documenting their experiences with the kind of detail that made it impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. They had recordings, emails, transcripts of counseling sessions where pastors had explicitly told them to stay with abusers, evidence of a systemic problem that went way beyond individual bad actors. What they uncovered was chilling in its consistency, story after story of women being told the same things Marie had been told, being given the same terrible advice, being sent back into danger with prayer and platitudes. They found patterns in how abusive men were protected, how accusations were handled, how victims were blamed and abusers were defended. They discovered that several men in leadership positions across their denomination had histories of abuse that had been quietly covered up, moved from church to church like the Catholic Church had done with predatory priests, given fresh starts while their victims were left to deal with the wreckage alone. The scope of it was staggering, the systematic nature of it was undeniable, and Marie found herself sitting on documentation that could blow up their entire denomination if handled correctly. Marie became their reluctant spokesperson, not because she wanted to be but because someone had to be, and she'd already lost everything anyway. What else could they take from her? She started speaking at conferences, at first just small women's events, then larger gatherings, then eventually at denominational meetings where male leadership had to sit and listen to the reality they'd been protecting themselves from seeing. Her message was simple but revolutionary in evangelical spaces. Safety matters more than image, abuse disqualifies someone from leadership, divorce isn't the unforgivable sin but covering up violence might be, and churches need policies that protect victims not predators. She spoke in that same tired voice I'd heard at the potluck years before, but now there was steel underneath, now there was purpose, now there was the kind of anger that doesn't destroy, it builds. The first time she spoke at a major conference, I was there in the audience, and I watched the room change as she talked, watched faces go from skeptical to shocked to understanding to angry. She didn't speak in abstractions or theological language, she told specific stories, detailed accounts of what women had experienced and how church leaders had responded, and the specificity made it impossible to dismiss. She read from emails where pastors told women to be more sexually available to their husbands to prevent affairs, from counseling notes where elders blamed wives for their husbands' violence, from text messages where women begged for help and were told to pray more and submit better. The documentation was damning, the pattern was undeniable, and by the time she finished speaking, the silence in that room was different than the silence at the beginning. This was the silence of people who could no longer claim ignorance. The pushback was immediate and vicious. Prominent pastors wrote blog posts about the danger of feminist infiltration, about how believing women automatically was reverse sexism, about how Satan was using hurt feelings to destroy biblical manhood. They accused Marie of having a Jezebel spirit, of being bitter, of wanting revenge instead of reconciliation, every accusation designed to discredit her witness without actually addressing the substance of what she was saying. Some churches split over the issue, literally divided down the middle between people who thought protecting abuse victims was more important than protecting institutional reputation and people who felt the whole conversation was an attack on God's design for gender roles. Marie received death threats, got doxxed online, had her children harassed at their new school, paid prices most people can't even imagine for the crime of telling the truth about what happened behind closed doors. One particularly vicious campaign against her was led by a blogger with a massive following, a woman actually, which made it worse somehow, a woman who built her platform on defending patriarchy and traditional gender roles. This woman wrote post after post attacking Marie's character, questioning her motives, suggesting she was probably exaggerating or outright lying, implying that any woman who left her husband was by definition unreliable and probably rebellious and definitely not someone Christians should listen to. The comment sections on these posts were cesspools of hatred, hundreds of people Marie had never met calling her names, speculating about her mental health, saying she deserved whatever happened to her. It was psychological warfare designed to silence her, to make the cost of speaking so high that she'd retreat back into obscurity, but it had the opposite effect. It made her angrier, more determined, more convinced that what she was doing mattered. But slowly, painfully, incrementally, things started changing, and this is the part that gives me hope even when the story feels heavy. Some denominations began implementing policies requiring background checks for all staff, mandatory reporting of abuse allegations, third-party investigations instead of internal ones. Some seminaries added domestic violence awareness to their curriculum, training future pastors to recognize signs of abuse and respond appropriately instead of defaulting to marriage preservation at all costs. Women's shelters started partnering with progressive churches, creating safe spaces specifically for people leaving religious contexts where divorce carried extra stigma and consequences. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, it was more like a crack in the foundation that kept spreading, kept letting light into places that had been dark for generations. Marie's ex-husband, Pastor David, he eventually faced consequences too, though not nearly enough in my opinion. The documented evidence Marie and other women provided became impossible to ignore, and after multiple investigations and testimony from former staff members who'd witnessed his behavior, he was removed from ministry, stripped of his credentials, officially disciplined by the denomination. He never went to jail, which still makes me angry when I think about it, never faced criminal charges because Marie didn't want to put her daughters through a trial and because honestly the statute of limitations on most of what he'd done had expired. But he lost his platform, lost his pulpit, lost the thing he'd valued more than his family's well-being, and there's a kind of justice in that even if it feels incomplete. Last I heard he was working some corporate job and attending a small church where nobody knows his history, living a quiet life that's probably still better than what he deserves. The process of holding David accountable was its own kind of trauma. Required Marie to relive everything she'd survived, to sit through depositions where lawyers tried to poke holes in her story, to watch him perform remorse for investigators while knowing it was just another mask, another role he was playing. There were moments she almost gave up, almost decided it wasn't worth it, that nothing would change anyway, so why put herself through this? But then she'd think about her daughters, about other women who might end up married to men like David, about the next pastor's wife who might not survive what she'd barely survived, and she'd find the strength to keep going. The church Marie used to attend, the one that had excommunicated her, they issued a public apology 3 years after she left. Not because they'd had a change of heart but because they couldn't ignore the pattern anymore, couldn't pretend David had been the only problem when more women kept coming forward with similar stories about how they'd been treated by leadership. The apology was careful, legal, sanitized of real accountability, but it acknowledged that they'd failed to protect vulnerable members, that their interpretation of Scripture had been used to justify harm, that they were implementing new policies to prevent future abuse. Marie told me she felt nothing when she read it, no vindication, no satisfaction, just a kind of numb acknowledgement that institutional change always comes too late for the people who needed it most. What she did feel something about was the other women, the ones who contacted her every week with their own stories, who told her that watching her survive had given them courage to leave, to speak, to demand better from their faith communities. She started a non-profit organization focused on training churches in trauma-informed care, in recognizing abuse patterns, in creating safety protocols that actually protect people instead of just protecting reputation. The organization started small, just Marie and a few other survivors working out of someone's living room, but it grew as word spread, as more churches realized they needed help navigating these issues, as more women came forward needing resources and support. They developed curriculum, created assessment tools, trained advocates who could walk alongside women trying to leave dangerous situations, built a network that functioned like an underground railroad for women escaping religious abuse. She wrote a book about her experience that became a bestseller in Christian circles despite, or maybe because of, the controversy it generated, A book that sits on nightstands in thousands of homes right now belonging to women who are trying to decide if they're brave enough to leave. The book, titled When the Shepherd Becomes the Wolf, didn't pull any punches, didn't sanitize her story to make it more palatable, didn't try to redeem David or suggest that maybe both of them shared equal blame. It was raw and honest and unflinching, and it struck a nerve with readers who'd been waiting their whole lives for someone to tell the truth about what happens behind closed doors in ministry families. The book tour was exhausting, required her to tell her story over and over, to answer the same questions, to face the same accusations from people who didn't want to believe that pastors could be abusers, but it also connected her with thousands of women who needed to know they weren't alone. She's not famous in the traditional sense, she's not on television or leading megachurches, but she's built something more important. She's built a network of survivors who are rewriting the rules about what faithfulness actually means. The women in this network come from all over the country, from different denominations and backgrounds, but they share common experiences, common wounds, common determination to make sure what happened to them doesn't happen to the next generation. They support each other through divorces and custody battles and the long, slow work of healing. They celebrate victories and mourn setbacks. They've become family to each other in a way their churches never allowed them to be. I see her sometimes still, at conferences or speaking events, and she's different now in ways that are hard to articulate. She laughs more, real laughter, not the performance kind, and her eyes don't have that drowning look anymore, that sense of someone barely keeping their head above water. Her daughters are in college now, both studying social work, both determined to help other families like theirs, both living proof that trauma doesn't have to be a death sentence, that healing is possible even when it's not linear or neat. Emma, the older one, wants to specialize in working with children from abusive homes, wants to be the person she needed when she was young and scared and didn't understand why her home felt like a war zone. Sarah is focused on research, on documenting the long-term effects of witnessing domestic violence, on building evidence bases for interventions that actually work. Marie remarried eventually to a man who's nothing like David, a man who loves her quietly and consistently, who thinks her strength is beautiful, not threatening, who's never once asked her to be smaller than she is. His name is Michael, and he's a carpenter, works with his hands, builds things that last, and there's something healing about that for Marie, about being with someone who creates instead of destroys. He'd been married before too, lost his wife to cancer, understands grief and trauma and the work it takes to trust again, doesn't expect Marie to be over what happened just because time has passed. They have this relationship that's built on honesty and choice, where both of them wake up every day and choose each other again, where neither of them takes the other for granted because they both know what it's like to lose everything. She told me once that the best part of her new life isn't the safety or the peace or even the love. The best part is that she's allowed to be boring now, allowed to just exist without constantly performing survival. She gardens, spends hours with her hands in dirt, growing things that bloom and die and bloom again, finding metaphors in the cycles of growth and dormancy. She reads novels again, loses herself in stories that aren't her own, remembers what it feels like to care about characters and plot twists instead of constantly scanning for danger. She sleeps through the night sometimes, doesn't wake up frozen in fear, doesn't check to make sure doors are locked multiple times, doesn't live in constant hypervigilance anymore. The ordinary, mundane, boring life she has now, it's precious to her in ways people who've never been terrorized can't quite understand. The impact of what she did, what she survived and then refused to stay silent about, it ripples out in ways that are still unfolding. There are now entire ministries dedicated to helping people leave abusive religious situations, therapists who specialize in religious trauma, support groups specifically for women recovering from complementarian theology gone toxic. The conversation has shifted, not everywhere, not uniformly, but enough that younger generations are asking harder questions about authority and submission, enough that some churches are genuinely rethinking their approach to marriage counseling and domestic violence. Seminary students are being taught different models, learning to ask different questions, being trained to prioritize safety over keeping families together at all costs. It's not perfect, we're nowhere near perfect, there are still countless women sitting in pews right now next to their abusers being told to pray and submit and endure, but at least now there's a counter-narrative, at least now there's proof that leaving is possible, that telling the truth doesn't make you a bad Christian, it makes you a brave human. What strikes me most about Marie's story, what keeps me up some nights thinking about the weight of it, is how much courage it took to choose truth over belonging, to risk losing her entire community for the chance at freedom, to believe her own pain was real and valid even when everyone she trusted told her it wasn't. The evangelical world she grew up in, the world that shaped her understanding of God and self and purpose, it taught her that her highest calling was to support male leadership, to maintain family unity at any cost, to see her own suffering as an opportunity for sanctification. Breaking free from that meant not just leaving a man but leaving an entire worldview, grieving the loss of certainty, accepting ambiguity and complexity in places where she'd once had clear answers. She talks about faith differently now, not with the rigid certainty of her former life but with something softer and stranger, something that makes space for mystery and doubt and ongoing questions. She still believes in God but not the version she was taught, not the God who demands women endure violence to maintain his reputation, not the God whose love comes with conditions and hierarchies and the threat of eternal punishment. She believes in something bigger now, something that doesn't fit neatly into the theological boxes her former church would approve of, something that prioritizes compassion over control and liberation over compliance. Some people call this deconstruction, some call it apostasy, she just calls it growing up, finally learning to trust her own instincts about what's healthy and what's harmful. The moral of this story isn't simple because life isn't simple, because trauma and healing and institutional change are all messy, complicated processes that resist neat conclusions. But if I had to distill something from Marie's journey, if I had to find the thread that runs through all this pain and transformation, it would be this: your safety matters, your truth matters, your life matters more than any institution's reputation or any theology's internal consistency. The people who tell you to stay quiet, to keep suffering, to protect abusers in the name of higher values, they're wrong, definitively and completely wrong, and history will judge them harshly for the harm they've caused and continue to cause. Speaking costs something, leaving costs something, telling the truth always costs something, but silence costs more, staying costs more, dying inside while looking perfect on the outside costs everything. Marie would want me to tell you that healing is possible, that the brain can recover from trauma, that you can rebuild a life after losing everything you thought you knew. She'd want you to know that leaving doesn't make you weak or faithless or vindictive. It makes you someone who believes they deserve to live without fear, and that's not selfishness, that's survival. She'd tell you that the shame belongs to abusers and their enablers, not to survivors, that you don't have to carry guilt for other people's choices, that protecting yourself isn't the same as destroying someone else even when they accuse you of exactly that. She'd say the hardest part isn't the leaving itself but learning to trust yourself again afterward, learning to believe your own perceptions when you've been trained to doubt them, learning to live in your body without constantly bracing for impact. If you're in a situation like Marie was, if you're reading this or listening to this or absorbing this in whatever way reaches you and recognizing your own life in her story, please hear this clearly: you deserve help, you deserve safety, you deserve people who believe you and support you without conditions or victim blaming. There are resources now that didn't exist when Marie first tried to leave: hotlines that understand religious abuse contexts, shelters that get why leaving church communities feels like leaving your entire world, therapists trained in both trauma and religious deconstruction. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7. They understand complicated situations. They won't judge you or tell you what to do. They'll help you figure out what your options are and support whatever decision you make. You don't have to figure this out alone. You don't have to be as brave as Marie was. You just have to take one next right step, make one phone call, tell one person the truth, choose yourself once even if it terrifies you. For everyone else, for those of us who aren't in active danger but who might work in churches or volunteer with religious organizations or just exist in communities where these dynamics play out, Marie's story is a call to vigilance, to advocacy, to refusing to be complicit in systems that harm vulnerable people. It means believing survivors when they share their stories, even when those stories implicate people we respect or institutions we value. It means pushing for policy changes that prioritize safety over reputation, that create real accountability for leadership, that don't allow Scripture to be weaponized against the people it's supposed to protect. It means being willing to lose social standing or community belonging if that's what integrity requires, being the kind of person someone like Marie could have come to and found actual help instead of religious platitudes. The transformation Marie experienced, the journey from victim to survivor to advocate, it didn't happen overnight and it wasn't linear or neat or Instagram-worthy. There were years of therapy, years of nightmares, years of flinching when doors opened suddenly, years of learning to believe she was allowed to exist without asking permission. There were setbacks and relapses and days when going back felt easier than moving forward, days when the loneliness of her new life seemed worse than the familiar horror of her old one. Healing from institutional betrayal is its own unique kind of grief because you're not just processing what one person did to you, you're processing how an entire system failed you, how the people you trusted most chose protecting their structure over protecting your body and soul. But here's what I've watched happen in the years since Marie first stood up and spoke her truth. I've watched her become fully human again, watched her remember how to dream and hope and trust and love without calculating the cost of each emotion. I've watched her daughters become strong women who don't tolerate disrespect, who understand healthy boundaries, who know their worth isn't tied to male approval or religious performance. I've watched a movement grow from her willingness to be the first one to break silence, watched other women find their voices because she used hers, watched churches actually change their policies because survivors refuse to be quiet anymore. The ripples keep spreading, keep reaching people in places Marie will never know about, keep proving that one person's courage can shift entire cultures if they're willing to endure the cost of truth-telling. So here's what I want you to take from this. Here's the affirmation that Marie herself would speak over you if she could reach through this screen or these words and touch your life directly. You are not responsible for other people's violence. You are not required to martyr yourself for anyone's theology. You are allowed to choose safety and call it faithfulness. You are allowed to leave what's killing you and call it obedience. You are allowed to tell the truth even when truth shatters illusions and disrupts comfortable systems. Your voice matters, your story matters, your survival matters more than any institution's image or any leader's reputation. Say this until you believe it. I deserve to be safe, I deserve to be believed, I deserve to heal, I deserve a life where fear isn't my constant companion and control isn't called love. The church as an institution is having a reckoning right now, not just with abuse in marriage but with abuse in leadership, spiritual abuse, financial abuse, every kind of harm that flourishes in environments that discourage questions and punish whistleblowers. Marie's story is part of that larger reckoning, part of a collective awakening to the gap between what Christianity claims to be about and what it often actually practices. This reckoning is uncomfortable, it's divisive, it's forcing people to choose between the comfort of familiar structures and the justice of necessary change, but it's also holy work, sacred work, the work of clearing ground for something healthier to grow. The old guard is fighting it, clinging to hierarchies and authority structures that benefit them, but the momentum has shifted, the conversation has changed, and more people are willing to say out loud that protecting abusers was never about biblical faithfulness, it was always about protecting power. What Marie did, what she continues to do, it's not superhuman or extraordinary in the sense of being beyond reach, it's the logical extension of believing you matter, of trusting that God or the universe or whatever you call ultimate reality doesn't require you to be destroyed for someone else's benefit. She's not a perfect hero, she'd hate being described that way, she's just a woman who got tired of dying and decided to live instead, who chose healing over performance, who refused to let her pain be wasted by staying silent about its source. The revolution she helped spark isn't about tearing down faith, it's about reconstructing it on a foundation of genuine love instead of toxic control, mutual respect instead of forced submission, truth instead of image management. Every woman who leaves now walks a path Marie helped clear. Every church that implements better policies does so partly because she and others like her refuse to accept the status quo. Every survivor who shares their story without shame does so standing on ground that pioneers like Marie fought to claim. The work isn't finished, won't be finished in our lifetimes probably, but it started, it's underway, it's gathering force and momentum and stories and voices, building toward a future where being the pastor's wife doesn't mean sacrificing yourself on the altar of his ambition, where church is actually safe for vulnerable people, where the measure of faith isn't how much suffering you can silently endure but how much love you can openly embody. Marie told me something once that I think about constantly. She said that the opposite of abuse isn't just the absence of violence, it's the presence of genuine freedom, freedom to be fully yourself, to express needs without fear, to exist as a complete person rather than as an extension of someone else's ego. She said she didn't know real freedom existed until after she left, couldn't have imagined what it felt like to breathe without waiting for permission, to have thoughts without screening them for potential punishment, to simply be without constantly performing acceptability. That's what she wants for everyone still trapped in situations like her former one, not just escape but actual liberation, not just safety but joy, not just survival but thriving, the fullness of life that was promised but withheld, the abundance that's possible when you're no longer spending all your energy managing someone else's instability. So wherever you are right now, whatever time zone or emotional space you're occupying, whether you're the survivor who needed to hear this or the ally trying to understand or just someone curious about how systems of harm perpetuate themselves, I want you to know that Marie's story matters, your story matters, the work of unraveling toxic structures and rebuilding healthier ones matters. It matters in the immediate practical sense of lives being saved and futures being reclaimed, and it matters in the larger spiritual sense of participating in the arc of history bending toward justice. Every person who chooses truth over comfort, who speaks when silence would be easier, who demands accountability from institutions that prefer secrecy, every single one of us is part of rewriting the narrative about what faith communities can and should be. The next video I'm putting out, and you're definitely going to want to stick around for this one, it's about something that'll blow your mind in a completely different way, about how one person's decision to break a completely different kind of silence ended up exposing something that shocked everyone who thought they knew the truth. But I'm not going to say more than that right now, except that you won't see it coming and you'll definitely want to be here when it drops. So if this story resonated with you, if Marie's courage sparked something in your own thinking about institutions and authority and the cost of truth-telling, do me a favor and let me know where you are and what time it is right now where you're watching this from. I love knowing this message is reaching people in different places and different moments, connecting us across all these distances through shared humanity and maybe shared struggles. Hit that like button if this moved you or made you think or just held your attention for 13,000 words worth of one woman's painful, beautiful, revolutionary journey. Drop into the comments with your location and your thoughts, and definitely subscribe because these are the kinds of stories I keep telling, stories about real people facing impossible choices and somehow finding the courage to choose themselves, choose truth, choose life even when everything in their world is telling them to stay small and quiet and compliant. These are the stories that matter, these are the ones that change us if we let them, and I'm not done telling them yet, not even close. Remember this, you are allowed to prioritize your safety, you are allowed to tell your truth, you are allowed to heal at your own pace, you are allowed to rebuild your life on your own terms, and anyone who tells you otherwise is trying to protect a system that benefits from your silence. Marie proved that one voice can shift a culture, that speaking up matters even when it costs everything, that survival is its own form of resistance and healing is its own form of revolution. Carry that forward, let it sink deep, let it give you permission to do what needs doing in your own life, whatever that looks like, however messy and imperfect and terrifying it might be. You are worth fighting for, worth choosing, worth protecting, and no theology or tradition or authority figure gets to tell you otherwise. That's the truth Marie lived into and the truth she'd want me to leave you with, so take it, believe it, live it, and never let anyone convince you that your suffering serves someone else's greater good, because it doesn't, it never did, and the people who said it does were always just protecting their own power at the expense of your peace.